Hello, my name is Lauren Field. I'm the Community Curator for Social History at Hull Museums and the Pride in Our City project lead. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Pride in Our City project as a whole. So that includes a digital exhibition which launched in 2020 and a physical exhibition which was on display at the Ferrens Art Gallery in 2021. I'm going to be talking to you about how we reach those goals and how, supported by our MPO funding from the Arts Council, the majority of the work towards those exhibitions was done online and how that affected engagement with young people. Hull Museum's representation of LGBTQ+ narratives has been limited in the past. In 2017, Hull was the UK City of Culture. This paved the way for citywide cultural events and LGBTQ+ programming, including LGBT 50 and a revamped Pride in Hull. LGBT 50 season was 2 weeks of events around Hull celebrating the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in the UK, but this didn't include the museums. However, we weren't silent, and in 2017 we created a spotlight on video on David Hockney and delivered an LGBTQ+ tour of artists around the Ferrens Art Gallery. This included the 2 paintings that can be seen here, so possibly our most popular work in the collection, The Lion at Home by Rosa Bonheur and The Seated Girl by Gwen John. In 2019, the Ferrens Art Gallery then hosted the exhibition Reflection, British Art in the Age of Change, which included a late event. So this was a night of creativity, inspiration and conversation which invited young people to take over the gallery, exploring identity through drag and live art. When we received our MPO funding, increasing LGBTQ+ representation and engagement with queer communities became a priority for us. The first thing that we did was start an LGBTQ+ working group. Members of staff were not invited to be involved in this working group because they identified as LGBTQ+, but to cover a cross-service, so to allow us to be in a position to actually achieve what we wanted with the relevant members of staff to help us get there. All with the common goal to help increase LGBTQ+ representation across Hull Museums via our research, interpretation and programming. We spent a lot of time identifying who had what knowledge, skills and abilities, and what realistically we could achieve together. We were very aware that the leap from nothing in the past 2 years to something may have to be modest to begin with, and our main objective was to reflect the diversity of our communities within our collections, whilst providing opportunities for development and groups to participate and engage. We began to understand how this project would fit our collections, how it would fit Hull Museums and what it delivers, but most importantly, how it would fit Hull and its people to ensure a future approach is sustainable and consistent beyond the lifetime of the MPO funding. Meaning, we didn't want to do something temporary to showcase queer representation, such as once a year for Pride, say, but to embed representation within our delivery. Then the COVID-19 lockdown was announced. We were just starting to make real progress and it felt like that would all come to a standstill. The working group that we had established had been starting to discuss organising a focus group, and how could we do that now? How could we reach out to our audiences from our own homes? Obviously, the situation wasn't ideal, but it put us in a position that forced us to look at what we were doing from a new viewpoint. We knew what the goal was. It was just getting there and the process which needed to be reevaluated. As with everything, we began thinking of new ways of digital engagement and how we could encourage new perspectives of our collections, improving access to LGBTQ+ narratives whilst building awareness and encouraging a change in attitudes. So the first step we took, as mentioned, was a very modest one. We simply began sharing on social media. So these collections aren't hidden, but the stories we were using them to tell were not visible within our interpretation. A lot of stories that we eventually began uncovering were just not detailed within our documentation, links to our collections between the objects and iconic figures in Hull's heritage who have interesting stories that were just not being told. One thing that we did discuss at length was negative responses online. We were very keen to plan ahead should there be any visible hate speech in response to our online activity. We had this at the forefront of our minds, especially during the time that the Ferens Late, discussed earlier, was being advertised. We were very aware of the potential damage that could be caused, especially as this was an event for young people, and we didn't want to be the facilitator of such a response. So we spoke with local organisations and social groups who helped us reach out to media teams and Humberside Police, who helped us understand the course of action we should take, should we need to. But luckily, we have never needed to implement this, as the response throughout the project until today has been overwhelmingly positive. And while we was doing this, I was also working with the University of Hull and the Hull History Network. So we reached out to students who may be interested in doing some research for us, helping us to identify queer stories and collections which were of interest to them, and they would then detail their research within a guest blog series on our website. So this was a great opportunity for us to provide, as is detailed on the blogs themselves from the students, for a number of reasons. So one student spoke about how it was reaffirming to research a historical figure who they felt they had a connection with, whilst another felt it interesting and important that we understand how we view history with a heteronormative lens. We had been discussing teaming up with Pride in Hull while still on site for our 2020 programming, so when the lockdown happened and most events were cancelled, it still felt like a natural step to take that we could help celebrate Pride, but just in a different way, which led to us discussing and developing a digital exhibition. So we teamed up with Pride in Hull and Yorkshire Mesmac, who are a local sexual health organisation, to discuss if this was something that could be achieved. We agreed pretty early on that it had to be a community-led exhibition, so yes, co-curated by us, but 90% led by our audiences. We were able to reach out to both local community groups and individuals via our social media channels to identify people who might like to get involved, people who felt like the exhibition and being involved in its creation would benefit them and help support them in a time when pride was taken away from people. Through discussion with Pride in Hull, we identified how essential it was for the museums to provide visible support and allyship now more than ever. Pride in Hull is an important event for many people for so many reasons, and we were in a position to create a space, a project that people could participate in and that would benefit them in ways that we hadn't seen before, providing support and an outlet for many people who were likely in lockdown in an environment where they couldn't be themselves, where they might be feeling alone and isolated. And we could present the opportunity to hopefully relieve that in some way. So we created a call for content. So this sat on a launch page on our website and we shared it directly with community groups. We wanted to provide these prompts for guidance and to get people talking. Once people began talking, we hoped that it would feel more of a relaxed situation for them to share. We understood it's not that comfortable to sit in front of a camera. We were all just getting used to Zoom. To sit and talk about yourself. Yorkshire Mesmac helped us facilitate these videos and help get people together digitally and navigate through this process. We also asked people to submit any images they felt illustrated pride that they wanted to share, or share any comments that they felt comfortable writing and sharing for us for the exhibition. Soon the exhibition went live, so it was available to access on the 25th of July 2020. And although I don't want to ruin it for you, I must insist you visit and take a look, as it is still available on our website. We were able to introduce what Pride is and why it's a major part of Hull's heritage. And as Andy says there in that quote, it is woven into the fabric of our city. This opportunity to highlight that Pride is an event not only brings people together but celebrates people for who they are was important to us. And, it's important to ensure that our local communities felt that support from Hull museums, not only during the pandemic, but from this point moving forward. We were very lucky to be able to work with Yorkshire Mesmac during the digital exhibition, and we were keen to maintain this relationship and build our partnership. We had also worked with Pride in Hull and the Hull and East Riding LGBTQ+ forum. However, we started to think about what was next for the project, and ultimately this manifested in a community-led queer retelling of our collections via an on-site exhibition at the Ferrens Art Gallery. However, even though this end output, if you will, a physical exhibition, was to be accessible in person, the lead up and the development was to be digital. We wanted to ensure that we could support the communities we would be reaching out to throughout the project, so we began working with a lead creative artist who would work directly with the community groups to lead workshops, to promote conversation and reflection, and to look at the collections at Hull museums to identify the collections that felt important to individuals, to share the stories that they wanted to tell while also encouraging creativity, ultimately producing their own work, whatever that means to them, that would go on display in the exhibition. So the artist conducted these workshops over Zoom, and the community groups that he worked with to do this were the Hull Roundheads, so they're an inclusive rugby team, and Corner House and the Warren, so they're local groups who lead youth groups, so Step Out, which is for 11 to 16-year-olds, and Shout Group, which is for young adults aged 16 to 25. At the same time, we began looking at the collection to identify relevant objects. So the idea was that although we identified objects from a logical sense, as in what is, physically possible to get on display, to get into the gallery, the finer choice, the choice of what ultimately would go on display and why, was to be the choice of the community groups via their interpretations, how they responded to the objects, and what they created to mirror this. The community-led aspect of the exhibition was to be something that we pushed from the onset, allowing us to say we're not only creating an exhibition, but a queer space within the gallery that we hoped would be used by people to socialise and to help support a much more diverse representation of Hull and its people, showcasing that Hull Museums is a space for everybody. Once we had the object list and the community groups were working with these, we did another call for content, so a public call for content. We were mindful that there would be people who wanted to get involved and share with us who weren't part of community groups, so these were available as digital downloads and also on our Google Drive, and this also meant that people could share with us anonymously. We also began including provocations, so you can see there at the bottom of this example. We would ultimately go on to use this format both within a trail and within the exhibition, and this kind of was, we were hoping anyway, to get people thinking about the wider themes represented by the collections, so things such as sexuality, identity and mental health. Throughout the development of the exhibition, we also created a Pride in Our City podcast. So for each episode of the podcast, we chat with a different person, who was working on the Pride in Our City project in one way or another. So this includes curators, artists, community members, and, social group representatives. The podcast is still available to listen to now and charts the development of the exhibition from start to finish. Meanwhile, inside the Ferens, a couple of months before the exhibition was to open, we launched the LGBTQ+ Gallery Trail. This trail, which is also available on our website, includes works in every gallery of the Ferens on the ground floor, exploring a different narrative to the work or the artist which hasn't previously been included on its label. The works included are identifiable via the rainbow labels, which you can see in the images there. It's worth just pointing out, which is a nice narrative. The image on the bottom left shows paintings by the two Roberts. So the two Roberts, as they were known, were Robert Cahoon and Robert McBride, who met in 1933 at art school before starting a romantic relationship. These two works by the two Roberts individually in the Ferens collection were not previously displayed side by side, so this was the first time. So to jump back to the community groups and what they were working on, the Hull Roundheads were speaking about vulnerability within the locker room for LGBTQ+ people and a double consciousness to their own behaviours, saying, you're there as a young person going through all these experiences, but you're not really one of them. There was an envy about the casual straightness, about how natural and confident and comfortable other boys were at school. This allowed them to connect with this painting by David Hockney from the Ferens collection and create this photography series which celebrates how the Roundheads exist beyond the limitations of stereotype and challenges the barriers facing LGBTQ+ communities in sport. Much like the way Hockney depicts multiple versions of self, the Roundheads chose to capture the multifaceted identities of the team members through this series of layered portraits, reflecting the multiple and varied aspects of what it means to be a rugby player. They also recorded an oral history project to accompany this, which looks at vulnerability of communal spaces and questions why sport holds negative associations for so many LGBTQ+ individuals. The audio piece offers a frank look at the spaces which shape us and their influences later in life. So the audio was available via a QR code in the gallery due to COVID safety around headphones. But it is still available on our website and as a bonus episode of the podcast. Queen Anne was said to have shared a romantic friendship with Sarah Churchill, who later became keeper of the Privy Purse. In 1708, rumours began suggesting Anne was having a same-sex relationship, and pamphlets were circulated to try and disgrace and humiliate the Queen. Inspired by the story of Queen Anne, the Step Out youth group created their own zine about the experiences of and issues facing young LGBTQ+ people today. So self-made publications have long been associated with LGBTQ+ communities, and Step Out created this zine to tell their own stories in their own way. Where Queen Anne fell victim to the power of publicity, Step Out wanted to use that self-published format of the zine as an act of reclaiming power. Copies of this were available for visitors to take away for free from the exhibition. And just to mention, if I may, I'll be delivering a talk on Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill later this year, so around July time at the Street Life Museum. So please do look out for that being advertised and come along if you want to know more. Through a number of workshops with the lead creative artist, Shout Group identified several objects within the Ferens Art Gallery and the Hull Museum's collections which resonated with them. They explored the history of these objects in relation to their own experiences and inspired by some of the political change makers represented in particular, Shout began to consider their own platforms to enact social change. And they came up with a number of slogans and statements that call for a better world, which they hoped via these powerful placards would help visitors to the Pride in Our City exhibition to better understand the kind of issues facing LGBTQ plus youth today. So a key part of the exhibition was that queer map of Hull. This is what it ended up looking like, because people began submitting experiences that they had had at school or at home, and of course, we couldn't pinpoint these on a traditional map. Visually, this piece was quite strong and emotionally quite difficult to digest. However, what came from this is that people began reading these personal accounts and seeing quite literally their own experiences reflected back. So one example of this is a visitor who approached me at one of our events to say she had been reading about what has been referenced to as the gay bench in Queen's Gardens on the map. It's a little secluded bench where people would meet up publicly but with privacy in a place where they felt safe. And she was shocked about this because her and her girlfriend in the 80s used to meet up on this bench. And in fact, she would share this photograph with us of them on the bench. And what she found upsetting is that at this time, they felt so unwelcome in Hull as a lesbian couple that they ultimately moved down to London, only returning years later to raise their children here. And it was not until she read about the bench in the exhibition that she discovered that other LGBTQ plus people were having the same experiences as her during a time when they had felt so alone. So once the exhibition was up, we began our events programme. We hosted an LGBTQ plus coffee morning in the space, aimed towards older people who we had struggled to engage with previously. But as it turned out, they wanted to visit the exhibition, but they didn't want to come alone. This was a chance for us to all socialise together and use the exhibition as that queer space that we had hoped to create. For Trans Awareness Week, we hosted a series of In Conversation With videos that provided a platform for trans voices. So these are still available on our YouTube page and our website. There was 3 digital episodes, and then the series ended with an in-person live event at the Ferrens Art Gallery, where we invited presenter Charlie Craggs, who is now in Doctor Who, to chat with Sean Fay, the author of the transgender issue. We also created an imagination library video for the book Families, 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 which identifies all types of families are valid for children. It's a children's book aimed at children. Again, we use the exhibition space to do this, and this can still be viewed on our YouTube too. We also provided the space for Yorkshire Mesmac to do their annual lifting of a red ribbon to mark World AIDS Day and promote their services as a sexual health organisation within the Pride in Our City exhibition. And for our final event, we invited the Bordello Collective for a 2-day residency at the Ferrens Art Gallery to celebrate and mark the closing of the exhibition. The collective explored, connected and interpreted the body of work in the exhibition and used this to create a multimedia live art happening right in the heart of the exhibition, and this was called You Are Welcome Here. This happening was responsive and incorporated spoken word, soundscape, audio-visual projections, installation and movement within their performance, and highlighted existing work whilst creating new work in response to the Pride in Our City exhibition and project as a whole. Following 2 years of digital engagement, meeting with people online and working apart, this programming was a wonderful opportunity for us all to meet in person and be in that queer space that we had hoped to create and that we ultimately did end up creating together. Don't worry if you missed the Pride in Our City exhibition. We currently have a digital scan of the exhibition available on our website, in which you can access all the content created and additional digital outputs, including videos of drag shows and a Pride in Our City playlist, which is on Spotify. All links to the content can be found within the scan. Speaking of the website, all content that I've mentioned today and much more is available on our Humber Museums Partnership website. So if you head on over to that and look for the project page, you will see the Pride in Our City project, and everything is available here. But if you have any questions, please do feel free to drop me an email or a tweet. And of course, please do follow us on social media, because the Pride in Our City project is an ongoing project. And although we have had 2 major outputs within the digital and the physical exhibition, hopefully there is much more to come.
So hi, I'm Evie, again one of the next 4 months students. Feels like home being back here, so thank you for the invite. So you can see we're sort of talking about distortion of the Holocaust and a bit more sort of focusing on how I then engage young people in the classroom. So I am a secondary school history teacher. This is my 3rd year, kind of first full year because of the pandemic, and it's sort of throughout just trying to think about how can I get students thinking about human rights, and in particular focus on the Holocaust and trying to move away from that now. So we are going to come back to this image in a moment. But yeah, like I said, this presentation is going to kind of focus on a podcast I was involved with. We'll hear a short bit of it, but then move on to thinking more effective ways of engaging young people. So distortion of the Holocaust can come in various forms, such as altering countries' involvement or an aspect of the Holocaust to aid political agendas or hide personal guilt. It can lead to national misconceptions of the Holocaust and the country's involvement in that. And a key example of this is Hungary. So as we saw in this image, this is a Holocaust memorial in Hungary, in Budapest, and it's meant to be portraying all victims of the Nazis. But in doing so, they're saying that Hungary was a victim. And there were Jewish people in Hungary that were victims, but not necessarily the country and the government involved. So this memorial is quite controversial. So the fact that it doesn't acknowledge their responsibility or their involvement or collaboration with the Nazis is what's problematic with that. So the podcast I worked on mainly focused on this. So it was a group of us from the Holocaust Education Trust. I think I went to Auschwitz with them in 2013, maybe, so quite a long time ago. And any sort of student that goes on the Auschwitz trip, the Lessons from Auschwitz program that they run, has the opportunity to become a regional ambassador. So all of us were ambassadors, and this was kind of our final project. And we thought we'll focus on Holocaust distortion, and particularly in Hungary. But Holocaust distortion can happen anywhere, in any country. Distortion of any events can also take place in that aspect. So we have Holocaust distortion in England around the idea of the kinder transport. The fact that the government, it always seems the government took ownership and helped save innocent children. However, we don't really acknowledge that actually they were pushed to do that. It was other individuals who made that happen. So distortion comes in many ways. And I think with the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, education was really pushed in a way of, we need to take more responsibility and ownership. Why are we distorting events to say we weren't as involved or we weren't as guilty? We need to take ownership and take responsibility for that. And that's sort of where, when I started education, this was the new movement, and this was where we kind of pushed towards. So the podcast, again, sort of focuses on how we sort of think about distortion, but also then specifically with Hungary as an example. So like I said, it was a combination of other young people. They were all at university, some of them were doing masters, some of them in their degree. I think we had one guy who was also doing an engineering degree at Cambridge, so a range of people who just were passionate about ensuring the Holocaust is still remembered, but human rights, and we worked together to have this podcast. So, if you look at that.
Hello! We are pleased to introduce you to the Regional Ambassador podcast about Distortions of the Holocaust. This podcast focuses on the case study of the Hungarian relationship to the Holocaust and how this country chooses to confront its past and for what reasons. This podcast will include an interview with Curator, who will recount his family's story about living through and surviving the Holocaust. We're extremely lucky to have this perspective for our project, and we believe it will contribute a unique insight into how Hungarian society remembers the Holocaust. Firstly, we would like to introduce ourselves as the creators of this podcast. My name is Chloe Smith, and I've been a regional ambassador for the last 5 years. I've just completed my BA at King's College London in War Studies and will be starting my MA in Conflict Resolution in September. Matthew Clayman is a PPE graduate from Exeter University and is a regional ambassador for London and the South West. Alan Kowalski is also an Exeter graduate in the Department of History. Alan has a specific interest in Eastern European politics and history coming from his Polish background. Evie is a secondary education history teacher, so has been integral to this project by aiding the presentation of historical facts. Last but not least, Jonah Zora is a manufacturing engineering student at the University of Cambridge and has been a regional ambassador for the last 5 years. Together, we have worked to produce this podcast about the distortions of the Holocaust to conclude our 5 terms as regional ambassadors.
There are many reasons why the Holocaust is distorted, and this varies depending on which country is analysed. For this podcast, distortion of the Holocaust will be defined as the purposeful rewriting or overwriting of historical events. The process of distortion then is inherently political. We can understand distortion coming from the bottom up or from the top down. Bottom up from society or culture. This can range from a reluctance to talk about the Holocaust, creating a void of conversation, allowing a perverse understanding of the Holocaust to fill it, or from the top down, governments having a direct interest in framing the narrative. For example, specific memorials of the Holocaust dominating capital cities, such as Budapest, to an attempt to criminalise the complicity of Poland during the Holocaust. Although this law was overturned, it's a clear indicator that events from 7 decades ago are extremely pertinent to the psyche of a nation. In order to help ground this podcast in a historical fact, a short context will be provided which will help situate the significance of Hungary within the Holocaust. Thank you, Alan and Evie.
The Holocaust in Hungary has been on occasion branded as one of the most perplexing chapters in the history of the event, to suggest why the Hungarian experience of the Holocaust has caused confusion among historians. As of March 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary for the first time, just 18 months before the end of World War II, 750,000 Jews still lived in Hungary. Just 4 months later, however, in July, as many as 440,000 were deported to Auschwitz under the oversight of SS officer Adolf Eichmann, who supervised the deportation. At the end of the war, 570,000 Hungarian Jews had died as part of the Holocaust. It remains astonishing how such large numbers, where each number represents an individual life that was disastrously cut short by fascist rhetoric taken to an abhorrent extreme, were destroyed within a matter of months. Many experts have embarked on their own mission to find answers to this phenomenon, but just in the past decade, the Hungarian state has actively aimed to either erase or misconstrue these findings as part of what has been called a history cleansing campaign. For example, Hungary had been a German ally throughout the war. Jewish persecution had begun long before March 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary, and Hungarian officials worked closely with the occupiers to facilitate the ghettoization and deportation of their country's Jews. The monument memorializing Hungarian victims of German occupation erected by the Hungarian government in July 2014 would lead you to believe that none of this is true, and that Hungary was in fact only a defenseless victim. The next section of the podcast will examine this sculpture in more detail, but it's perhaps with these facts that we can begin to understand how human life was able to be destroyed in such a short period of time, an obliteration that the Hungarian state has very deliberately aimed to reshape into a national blind spot. Why would Hungary want to misconstrue its involvement in the extermination of Hungarian Jews? Unsurprisingly, this has been a question at the centre of many academic investigations, some of which have suggested the double dictatorship paradigm as an answer.
Both Nazism and communism had robbed the nation of its collective agency in the period between March 1944, when Hungary was occupied, and May 1990, when communism fell in Hungary. Accordingly, as the 2011 Hungarian constitution put it, Hungary needed a spiritual and intellectual renewal on the back of decades of moral decay. Admitting complicity in the murder of the country's Jews during World War II would not have served as a means to this end, but focused on the righteous acts of war, canonical heroes whose actions defended national culture, proved a solution to the Constitution's mission, even though some of these heroes themselves were complicit in the final solution in Hungary. The example of Miklos Horthy's region of Hungary throughout most of World War II demonstrates his political strategy. The government of current Prime Minister Viktor Orban has rehabilitated the Horthy era into present day by shining a spotlight on carefully selected facts such as the regent's decision on the 6th of July 1944 to halt the deportation of Budapest Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau, thereby saving their life and consequently claiming the right to be remembered as a champion of the righteousness. But the same day the government fails to identify that on the same day, July 6, 1944, all of Hungary, with the notable exceptions of Budapest, had already seen its Jews deported to Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau under the leadership of Horthy. Similarly, Horthy's constitutionally appointed a pro-German government while regent and consciously chose not to be involved in Jewish affairs, thereby giving a free hand to those involved in the final solution programme. Horthy was a Nazi collaborator, but his acts in aiding the Holocaust have been overlooked by the Hungarian government. Unfortunately, historical facts can readily be manipulated, reshuffled and revalued to serve political ends. Perhaps the lawmakers in charge believe that by doing so, they are doing their countries a favour. It is undeniable that countries in Eastern Europe have had wretched experiences during the respective periods of totalitarianism, starting with Nazi occupation and then followed by communist rule forced upon them by the Soviet Union, equally depriving these countries of sovereignty, agency and individual liberty. But by distorting and misconstructing their involvement in the Holocaust, these nations are not doing themselves any favours. Instead, they are propagating an obfuscation of the truth, which is a dangerous thing to do. As the Roman philosopher Cicero said, memory is the treasury and the guardian of all things.
With this historical context in mind, we now turn towards the interview section of this podcast. And I urge you to think about the context and the history throughout and to develop your own questions too.
Introduced Gergő Tóth, who is a Hungarian student at King's College London studying war studies and history. He is 22 years old and born and raised in Hungary, Budapest. He had a research internship at the Hungarian Holocaust Memorial Centre, which we also visited in the Budapest trip in 2018. What's interesting about Gergő's upbringing, though, is that his mother's side of his family is Jewish and his father's side is Catholic. So he was brought up with two very different cultures, and this is something that I think will be really, really integral to this part of the podcast. Hi Gergő, thank you for joining us for the podcast about the distortions of the Holocaust in Hungary. We really value your input, especially regarding the complex relationship Hungary has with the Holocaust. So just quickly, and just with whatever words you want to describe, can you start off by telling me a bit about your family story of the Holocaust and about your mother's side, particularly of the Jewish experience, and just basically whatever you know?
Sure. Thank you, Chloe, for having me here today. So about my family's history, my mom's side of the family is Jewish ethnically. None of my family members are actually religiously practicing anything. So my mom's side of the family actually lived in various places in the country during the war. And unfortunately, I don't actually know much about their history. I know that 4 of my great-grandparents, my mother's side, were in Auschwitz, but 3 of them actually returned. they died shortly after returning to Hungary, though.
Oh wow! So they were deported to Auschwitz in like 1944, and then survived and came back.
Yes, exactly. Wow. Only like one of them did not return.
Okay.
And my granddad was a kid during the war. I think he was born around 35 or something like that. And he came to the capital because he was from the countryside, and he was hiding with a Catholic family in the capital.
Oh, he was hiding. Do you know where he was hiding?
Yeah, actually, he kept being in touch with the family after the war ended too. It was a Hungarian Catholic family, but they moved to Vienna after the war shortly.
Okay.
And my mom's mom, my grandma, was also alive during the war because she was born in 1938, but she was a baby. And actually, I asked my mom about this, and she doesn't even know where she was during the war. But her parents were in Auschwitz, so she must have been somewhere in Hungary, but we don't actually know where.
Because there's a lot of stories, I guess, of because the Hungarian Jewish community was particularly assimilated in Budapest especially, but also in the countryside, you do get a lot of these stories of babies actually being hidden by families and adopting children from the ghettos in all sorts of countries in Eastern Europe. But yeah, so that's really interesting. So obviously your granddad is maybe one of the main characters of the story that you're speaking about with your family. So he grew up obviously in Hungary after the war, and did he marry a Jewish lady as well after the war? Was your grandma Jewish?
Yeah, my grandma was Jewish too, yeah. And
obviously then had your mum and she her siblings, etc. So do you think, obviously speaking to your mum and like me, obviously you didn't meet your granddad, did you?
No, I did meet him.
Yeah.
He only died like 10 years ago.
So did he speak to you a lot about what happened, or was it very something that you felt was a bit taboo?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's like a big taboo in Hungary. Not necessarily, but I would say most people does not like talking about the war at all.
Right.
And I think that's especially true for people who experience the Holocaust and stuff like that.
So do you think it was, because obviously there's this narrative that was shaped, like, you know, within the USSR about the collective experience of victims of Nazis, which we will go on to talk about a bit later. But actually there kind of is this like, not sometimes maybe not a distinction actually of the specific suffering and the specific experiences of Jews that lived in the Holocaust. That I just think maybe hasn't really been spoken about. And even when I was going to Hungary, I just didn't think that was something that was really, really focused on. So speaking from your own experiences, do you think that your granddad kind of not speaking a lot about his experiences, do you think that probably is a common thing in Hungary, not to speak about Holocaust experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that it is. It's probably, yeah, as you said, there are like two sides of remembering, or like having memories of the Holocaust, and one is the collective and the other is the individual side. And individual experiences have been, I think they have been neglected for a while in Hungary now. It's probably due to the way we see history, and also probably due to communism after the Second World War too. Mm-hmm. But in general, the 20th century is deeply stigmatized in Hungary somehow. Yeah. So we still can't really talk about the biggest issues and about like the guilt and shame that came with all this stuff. So I think it's definitely it's hard to talk about it for everyone, and that's probably the reason why I personally don't know much about my family's history.
Yeah. So as you said about your great-grandparents, so they went to Auschwitz and then they actually were able to come back to Hungary, and they lived in Hungary after the war, obviously, for a while, but they did die shortly afterwards. So as you were kind of saying, it's not something that's encouraged about. Do you think now in the 21st century, in 2021, sort of maybe not talk about the political kind of context of Hungary right now, but do you think then that it's still not encouraged for survivors to talk about their experiences of the Holocaust?
It's hard to say. I would say that it is not encouraged, because simply the way we look back at history is somehow does not really work on the individual level as much as it does in Western countries, I think. So there's still much to catch up on for Hungary regarding its history, because these personal stories and experiences are probably much more important than how they are treated today.
I just think it's just such a shame, because I think in Hungary, like even compared to other capitals in Europe, you can definitely still see a very strong, perhaps not Jewish population, but definitely a Jewish presence. You know, you've got one of the biggest synagogues in Europe. You've got so many memorials. You can't really go round a corner in Budapest without seeing some memorial, either to the Holocaust or to the World War II. And I think that's something that I think all European countries should be looking to. And I think Hungary arguably does lead in that way. I think when I went round, I was extremely impressed by the way that they memorialise people, but also people that aren't perhaps very popular or very well known in Hungarian history. They still kind of had memorials there, and I think that was really, really interesting for me to look at. But I just think it's interesting how they have these memorials, but they fall short of speaking about the individual experiences and then the collective experiences of the Holocaust in Hungary, because Hungary was obviously extremely integral as a country to what has now become known as the Holocaust, especially Auschwitz, especially sort of how lethal Auschwitz was, and how the Hungarian Jewish population kind of contributed to this, to the lethalness of it.
Yeah.
So just continuing with the memorial kind of side of it. So in 2014, actually just outside the US Embassy, I think you know what we're going to talk about now, is the memorial to all the victims of the German occupation was erected for the 70th anniversary of the Nazi occupation. So you've got Hungary represented as this like cowering kind of figure, and
like an angel.
And with the angel, and then you've got this big figure over it, attacking it. It's definitely very much like black and white. You know, Hungary was innocent, and then you've got the Nazis as being this really, really oppressive force.
So I think that's the general kind of feeling towards Hungary's role in the Holocaust, but the Soviet occupation was somehow quite different, because we still look back as if it was something put on us from the outside, as if it was just the Soviet Union, and it was definitely truer than it was for the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Even if there were Hungarians who introduced communism to Hungary, but you can argue that the presence of the Soviet army and stuff like that were much more influential than the 100 German officers during World War II in Hungary.
Because I think your point is that it's not that they don't acknowledge it, because I think when we visited the Hungarian Holocaust Centre, when we were in the main exhibition, I've been to many museums to do with the Holocaust. Been to one in London, Berlin, Israel, obviously Poland, but the Hungarian one was particularly very, very graphic. I've seen photos in there that I haven't ever seen anywhere else, right? So I think to kind of say that they don't acknowledge it is very inaccurate. But then I do think there is this thing of, as you said, with your family and also other Holocaust survivors, is not being encouraged to talk about it. And I think then this kind of does contribute to the overall distortion of the Holocaust, that actually it was something that was forced upon Hungarians themselves, and it wasn't, there weren't many collaborators, or collaborators weren't eager to do this work. And I think it also absolves the existing anti-Semitism in Hungary before the war, because of course there was before the war. So I'd just like to quickly talk to you about your role in your internship at the Holocaust Museum. So kind of how you got it, why how long you did it for, what did you learn from there, and could you identify from working there, some of the particular distortions of the Holocaust that you think are relevant particularly to Hungary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Holocaust Memorial in Budapest is actually a government organization, but I think it does a really good job at remembering the Holocaust and educating people about it. So my role, I actually was in the research department, so my role was not actually connected to education as much as it could have been, because it had a museum part and a research part too. So I was in research and I was analyzing old files like reports and the diplomatic papers and stuff like that. But I think one of the best thing that this museum does, and one of the most important thing that it tells us about is the question of collaboration. I think that is what the whole museum is built up around somehow. I think mainly because collaboration and the question of collaboration is really, really hard to talk about today even. It's not there. The lines between collaboration and not collaboration, or just idly standing by and stuff like that, is so blurred. It's really thin. It's really hard to tell what is what. And there are like several really good examples to how one single decision could make you a collaborator, or how something made you a hero during the Holocaust. And to some extent, you could say that every people who survived the Holocaust in Hungary was a collaborator in some extent.
Yeah.
Because how could millions of people watch the genocide of other millions? But at the same time, this museum also tells us how the everyday people just wanted to survive every day, regardless of everything, and how people had to do stuff to survive. For example, occupying their deported Jewish neighbors' flat, for example, to survive bombings and stuff like that. So it's really hard to draw the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the distortion also of like who can be considered a collaborator. So do you have to really be doing something very violent? Do you actually have to escort your Jewish neighbours to the Danube, for example, to be shot in one of those massacres? Or are you a collaborator if, as you said, you just occupy a Jewish neighbour's flat from bombings, because that's what happened, and it is
exactly.
It is the choice of everyday citizens to survive what's going, because obviously when you had the USSR coming in to invade Hungary afterwards to liberate Hungary, and this is another thing as well with inverted commas about liberating Hungarians from the trauma of the Nazis and their regime, and it's what you do every single day. And I think that's really, really interesting. So I was just going to kind of take you back to your schooling and your school age. So when you were younger, do you remember like learning about the Holocaust for the first time, and how old you were?
I think my experiences are not really representative of the whole country.
Right.
Like, for my parents, it was always important that they teach us about the war and about the Holocaust. So I actually don't even remember the first time there was not a single time that I was told about the Holocaust. It wasn't really like that. It was always somehow part of my upbringing.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that it's true for everyone. You can definitely live in Hungary until the age of 15, 16 without having heard about the Holocaust at all.
Okay.
Which is scary. I don't think you can start learning about it too early. Of course, you don't want to show children the graphic stuff and the terrible part, but you can always somehow there's always space for explaining and understanding it. For example, I think the Holocaust Memorial in Washington DC, the museum, does a really good job at it. It has a kids part and an adult part.
You have to be careful.
And I was there. Yeah, but I think it does a good job at kind of explaining it to kids too.
So do you think like there's a difference in geography when it comes to language? So do you think, perhaps, obviously speaking from someone that has grown up and lived in Budapest their whole life, do you think people in Budapest are more educated about the Holocaust compared to people in the countryside who maybe might not have ever met a Jewish person before?
Yes, I would say it's probably true that Holocaust education in the capital is better than in other places. Although I've never in school in the countryside. It's probably true in general that education is just somehow better in the capital than in other places. And also living in the capital, you somehow see these memorials and the history all the time. You see the bullet, like the shots on the walls, and you can see the little stamp, like the stones on the ground. I don't know if you remember.
The Stolper stones.
Yeah,
exactly. The gold ones. I think it's Stolperstein. I think they're always. Even when I was in Hungary and we were trying to get out of the rain, and we ended up walking into some really, really like random street, and I was getting a bit scared, and we tried to like cover from the rain, and suddenly I just like looked down and there was these like 4 gold stones, and I was just like, it's mad that literally anywhere in Budapest, but also probably like in every single capital and places in Europe, is that it's always there confronting you, and it forces you to confront the past. You can't escape it somehow. No. It's always there. Yeah. So do you think Holocaust education in Hungary, do you think it serves a significant purpose? So for example, in Britain, we have to learn about the Holocaust. It's like one of the only things in the kind of the history syllabus that is 100% required, and normally British students learn about it in year 9, so when we're 14, and there is a lot of debate in Britain about how good it is, how well, sometimes it's just a few weeks at the end of term in the summer when everyone's tired and you suddenly have to learn and watch these kind of distressing images on the screen. But in Hungary, do you think that the education about the Holocaust, do you think it serves a significant purpose, and do you think that the way it's taught, do you think perhaps it absolves some of the blame from the Hungarian state, or do you think it's kind of taught very, very well?
I partly think that it is true that it absolves some of the blame, because it is true. This memorial is probably the best example to how the Hungarian state tends to just kind of they tend to try to make it a bit less important than it was, I think. And that is ingrained in education too. At the same and Hungary in general, not just about the Holocaust, but Hungary likes to be the victim in history.
Right. Okay.
Listen to the anthem, for example. The Hungarian Anthem is about how Hungary has been repressed for decades and centuries, and how the future is going to be better.
Okay.
And I think that's a big part of Hungarian mentality, and that's also a really toxic thing about Holocaust education. But at the same time, I'm not sure that this is a particular purpose behind education in like Holocaust education in Hungary. I'm not sure if there is like a deliberate effort to make the Holocaust unimportant in this sense, or the Hungarian state's role in it. It's probably more like the result of so many different political leaderships trying to understand and evaluate the past again and again so many times that now it's really hard to see how to approach the whole topic somehow.
Yeah. So speaking of the future and trying to make you a figure for change, Gergo, and some of your experiences, how do you think we as the next generation, so in Hungary but also around the world, when we're learning about the significance of Hungary in the Holocaust, how do you think that we should address distortions of the Holocaust, and how do you think what are the ways that we can challenge distortions of the Holocaust?
So I think I have a really obvious answer, but I think discussion and conversation is definitely a good solution. And as long as people are willing to engage in debate and having sensitive discussions about the topic, I think we're on the right track. And I think a part of this is that we ourselves should not really stigmatize Holocaust, or we should be as open as we can.
Okay.
So, for example, in Hungary, it is illegal to deny the Holocaust, so you can't say that it did not happen because you can actually go to jail for that. I personally don't really like that.
Why?
I don't think that the fact that it is illegal will ever convince anyone that it did happen.
Okay.
I think conversation and history education and showing personal experiences to these people would be much more beneficial for the Hungarian society somehow.
So do you think there's a role in this of like increased like awareness through perhaps maybe survivor testimony and also like visiting actual sites that basically were sites of the Holocaust? Do you think maybe encouraging younger people to perhaps go and visit Auschwitz or visit some of these memorials, do you think that this would decrease levels of distortion that we're seeing?
Yeah, I definitely think that would be really useful. Even like if you go to Budapest, the whole city is basically a big memorial to what happened in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And if you go out there and show people what there is to see and what actually happened, and maybe even have people to talk about what happened to them, because these are the last few years when you can actually do that. I think that's really helpful. But there are good. So it's the memorial in Szabadság is not the only example. So there are actually good examples to this as well. And I think the memorial center is one of them.
Yeah.
So, for example, you have that big black wall, and there's a team whose job is to find names for that black wall, and they try and go back and find as many victims of the Holocaust as they can. And I think that's, for example, really personal, and like it's a really beautiful thing.
So I think the main things we can take away from this conversation about the distortions of the Holocaust is that they do exist, but they don't have to take over the truthful narrative of what actually happened. And I think Hungary does enough, or as you think, you know, there are multiple resources that we can learn about the Holocaust in a way that remembers victims, in a way that doesn't distort the Holocaust, but it's actually us as the new generation coming up to be responsible and actually take these opportunities and learn, because yes, there are memorials, but you can walk past them and not stop and think. And I think, you know, it's like the saying was like, a picture or like a photograph, you know, it says 1,000 words, but it only says 1,000 words if you actually stop and you think those 1,000 words. So actually you have to stop and really reflect on these things in order to come away with some sort of ideas about what happened in the past, and actually fully challenge yourself to learn new things and to change the way you think. So do you have any concluding comments about this conversation about what we can do to collectively challenge distortions?
I think if I had to summarize it in one word, that would be discussion.
Yeah.
Because it is important to talk about this kind of stuff. And even though many of the people who were there can't talk about it now, but it's important that we do it for them.
Exactly.
I think what we owe the whole story.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Gergo. It's been a brilliant conversation. After interviewing Gergo and reflecting on his experience as someone who was connected to the Holocaust, but also to modern-day Hungary, we had many of our questions answered, but still many more questions as a result of this discussion. Why does the Holocaust in particular cause so much controversy in some countries that distortion is needed to frame a certain narrative? In the case of Hungary, it's not debatable that the Hungarian population as a whole suffered due to multiple invasions and occupations, but the specific and unique experience of Hungary's Jewry should not be ignored or overshadowed. Both facts do not and should not contradict each other and should be treated carefully in order to respect the victims of World War II. Distortions are often dangerous and give rise to other distortions, and in some cases, denial of the Holocaust, which is of course illegal in several countries across Europe, but that does not negate the fact that it still happens. So what are some of the things we can do to fight against distortions of the Holocaust? As Gergo suggested, we need to present hard facts that cannot be argued against. Education and awareness are the key to battling distortions. This is why memorials, museums and educational resources are integral to the future of Holocaust education, and also fighting against purposeful and political distortion of the Holocaust. The Holocaust should not be politicised to benefit governments or to try and shift the blame. The Holocaust was an unprecedented event and should be remembered as such. As we look to a future where the number of Holocaust survivors will become less, it is especially important that now, more than ever, we challenge distortions and present the truth. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Gergo's family and Gergo for sharing their story, and we hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. Thank you.
So it was quite a challenge creating the podcast. It was something we were set by the Holocaust Educational Trust. It was a regional ambassador sort of final piece, and it was quite difficult trying to manage that. It was during the Christmas lockdown with people that obviously had a bit more time than I did with working, but it was something quite powerful to be involved with, creating something technological, something very different. I'd done lots of speeches at Holocaust Memorial Day talking about this, but not necessarily something using technology, which was quite interesting to do. It's a way that I haven't necessarily used in lesson, but when I mentioned to students that I was part of it, they're like, oh, it comes in, like, didn't know that's a thing. So it was something that was quite useful, getting students to think about there's other ways you can access information. And my A-level topic doesn't specifically have the Holocaust in it, but I've said to them, like, look at these websites, look at these other podcasts to help them go, okay, I can learn more, and I don't need to learn that necessarily just from my teacher in the classroom. So that's sort of one method I've used to sort of engage students more so. So that, like, this section of the presentation kind of really focusing on other methods I use sort of within the classroom, and not necessarily always with technology, but just more generally. So teaching the Holocaust is a difficult topic. I found it's been a challenge like pre-pandemic and then more so during the pandemic. We did have an online Holocaust survivor talk during the pandemic, and it was a challenge trying to make sure connections work and having it in 7 different classrooms and all students being able to engage with it. And it was sort of definitely some new things have come around of, do we just stay online, where survivors are still feeling more vulnerable and coming out into schools, and it means they don't have to travel as much, or do we go back to that face-to-face? But we've tried both attempts, and that's something that's been really, really effective. And another aspect that I think is key is, as like educators, we showing our passion. Like, I think we forget, I especially went into teacher training, forgetting how I'm so passionate about making sure the Holocaust is remembered and all human rights topics, but young people aren't, they're not at that passionate stage yet. So how do we encourage them to get to that point? And one of the methods we try at our school is a cross-curricular approach. So we developed a scheme of work between history lessons and RS lessons. And the point was to show, oh, 2 teachers are talking about it at the same time. That must mean this topic's really important. And then going, oh, they're working together, like they know what each other is teaching. And they're thinking, right, so this must be something I need to pay attention to. And it did sort of generally, we thought, helped install a bit more respect into the topic. We were able to divide content. It wasn't too much for the history department to try and cover all the events and then our rest to focus on other moral lessons. We were able to divide that and add on to each other. And again, we trialled that during the pandemic. There was other challenges with that, new challenges this year, whereas last year we had 2-hour lessons, trying to adapt that then into 1-hour lessons, trying to get in exam time and assessment prep. Like, there's always different challenges, but we found that generally the students feel more sort of empowered to pay attention and feel that respect for it because they're seeing multiple teachers talk about it at the same time. And then when we combine that with a survivor talk, it makes it real. It makes them, oh, this is human life. This is our current history. And that's another method that I found has been very, very effective in not just sort of the Holocaust, but other human rights topics, using human voice. In that moment when I first heard survivor was that empowering moment. I was like, this is our history. History lives with us. It's not, oh, it's just in the past, I learned about it in class. It makes it more human to them. So you can see this is Freddie Nola. He's a Holocaust survivor from Vienna. Meeting him was, again, an empowering moment. I was lucky enough to do a workshop talking about the new Holocaust memorial. It's meant to be put in London. Still in the process of that happening. Hopefully it will. And just hearing from him, hearing his story, but not necessarily just about what he'd been through during the Holocaust, but life after, his perception of modern society, his question of other rights. That was really empowering, and we found that giving a student a name, a face, like a backstory, a family, like they're interested in football, you like football, it makes it more human and more personal to them. And it sort of makes them think, oh, okay, this person's alive, so it's not that old. Like, we look at history and they think black and white, this person's not alive anymore. And unfortunately, Freddie isn't alive. He passed away earlier this year at 100, so he has lived a very long life, and it just gives them that thing of this is real, this is people, and especially when they see someone in person, that kind of realisation comes in. But we are so lucky to have so many testimonies from various events to do with human rights, and the Holocaust is one that we aren't going to have forever, and that's where the memorial is meant to be a big focus on using technology to do that. We're lucky he's written a book, he's done audios, podcasts, he's done video interviews, same with many other survivors, and holograms were meant to be something new that's going to come into the memorial. Again, not built yet, but it'll be really exciting when they do. And remember, this was what I was with Freddie at for this day, and I think there was 100 survivors, and they talked about whether they liked the holograms, what the point of it was, how it's going to help, and they said they sat down over the course of a few months and recorded 3 answers to 100 different questions, variations, so any student can walk up to them, ask a question, and they get an authentic response, and kind of that's cool. Being able to talk to a hologram of someone who's not here anymore, that's another way that we can think about satiates, that their memory's not going to die when they die. We can keep them alive through us being experiencing it, us being testimonies themselves. We become sort of 2nd, 3rd, 4th generations just by listening to them and keeping their memories alive. So it's definitely an effective method of engaging young people. The Holocaust calls for human rights using human people and human voice and individuals in particular, like Shannon mentioned Harriet Tubman, giving them a person to focus on makes it more real to them, makes them feel that connection of, oh, I can identify with that person, even if it's something they have an interest in one particular aspect of life. Like I said, I spoke at many Holocaust Memorial Days over the years, and hearing other survivors from other genocides has also been so empowering. And that's something I found when I first taught the Holocaust, teaching it, and I got to the end and I was like, why are you not so passionate about this? To my 13-year-old students, why do you not get it? And then I showed them clips about Rwanda, and they're like, it's in colour. That was the moment, and sort of giving them modern perspectives, looking at any post-Holocaust genocide, and that it still does occur. That's been my sort of focus with the Holocaust Education Trust, that it hasn't stopped. Genocide still continues. And students are realising that more and more, and they want to talk about current affairs. They see what's happening in Ukraine, and they go, this isn't right. They feel that sense of injustice, and that's another method that I think is really key, letting them feel that frustration and anger, and how we channel that, guiding them to go, how can we feel that frustration, see that injustice, see that violation of rights, and what can we do about it, even if it's something as small as trying to find a fundraising event at school. We did a chess competition, because we thought it would engage students, but it then raised money, and then we sent sort of a thank you and a note to all the sort of staff that got involved, but that was by the kids, that was what they wanted to do, and helping them channel that is another really effective method. And then another one that kind of links back to the work I did here with Nick at Wise, my dissertation, looking at one event and how that can lead into pathways of other events to do with human rights. Not necessarily they're exactly the same, but I focused on South African education, how they used the Holocaust to confront apartheid. And I know it's you think that's a bit of a stretch, but you could do it in other subtle ways. It was a way of getting people in South Africa to talk about an event that had similarity in terms of early persecution and legal action to reduce people's rights, then think about the differences, but then using that as opening up conversations. And the Holocaust and Genocide Centres around South Africa have been very effective in using museums to do that. So they'd encourage students, and it's obviously very vast, in terms of geography, and they'd have to travel quite a while, but they then do a series of workshops in the museums to talk about this and talk about the comparisons and think about how we can open up those conversations with young people and educate. Teachers found it more, especially in the mid-2000s in South Africa. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to discuss what they had just been through. So it's how can they use other events to open up and feel more comfortable confronting their own history, and then that's become sort of a nationwide focus. There's free centres, there was free centres when I did my dissertation, and they become very effective in using museums and workshops to do that. But we can do that in really subtle ways. I find in education, I talk about Hitler's involvement in World War II and basically did he have a master plan? That's our A-level course. And little ways of bringing in, talking about his expansionist policy and Lebensraum as his sort of living space idea, and then sort of comparing that to Russia and Ukraine, like the idea of expansion, the idea of wanting to claim land, like how easily can these events escalate? And when I think I was teaching it the next day after Russia had sort of invaded, and it blew their mind to think there is connections to the past, and that's little ways we can open these pathways to students, and they do want to talk about it. They are aware. We mentioned earlier about technology being such a big part of students' lives. How can we use that to sort of keep their engagement? And that sort of links on to how the students view human rights. So one of the things that I learned whilst teacher training was that like the national curriculum wants us to have moral lessons in every single lesson possible. That's a really big task. Like getting students to understand human rights is difficult. Do they understand what the word human rights means? Do they understand when things are violated? Talking to some students the other day, they wouldn't necessarily connect the Holocaust with human rights. That's a hard connection for them to make. But students are reading the news. They do know what's happening. When I was at school, I didn't read a newspaper. I probably got my news from TV or the radio. Now it's alerts on their phone. They get it through Twitter or Instagram or even TikTok. Like they get it in every platform. They are more aware than sort of previous generations. So it's how can we do that? Like they take human rights. Everyone takes human rights for granted until we talk about topics to do with human rights. And that's the challenge I found in education. Like when do we bring it in? That's not necessarily a human rights based topic, but how can we connect to that? And it is difficult. It's a very big task that the national curriculum wants us to do. But how can we do that? How can we get students to think about the human rights topics when not necessarily looking at a specific human rights issue? And those moral lessons can be missed when like time pressure of getting assessments done or exam prep or making your lessons so fun and engaging that you don't want to always talk about suffering, but how can we bring them in sort of on the side and something so subtle? So like with the history available that we do, talking about Hitler, but also just bringing in modern things just on the side, just to help them realise that connection. Like I said, we don't think that young people read the news, but they do. They get it through every form or platform, but then that also has its problems. Not every news is true. We have fake news, we have distortion. This is where distortion of events comes in, when people are promoting news and talking about events when they don't have that backing or they don't have the reliable resources. And there's been a lot of anti-Semitic sort of or Holocaust distortion of things on TikTok, for example, or in video games. I've seen it for like action-based games and then making like concentration camps and making then comments about that, and that's where students are going to think that's real. Oh, this is what it was like. Oh, I saw it on TikTok, so it must be true. And then that opens up them talking about it with their friends, and then it becomes a theme where they're unintentionally distorting the past, but they don't realise that. So one of our jobs and a way of us engaging them to use that and use what they've seen in an effective way is guiding them on how to notice when news is true and what the correct news is that we should be looking at. So that's another thing we do. As mentioned, I'm head of Year 7 this year, and we do a news day every day, and we sort of, news round is a nice one, they get excited, there's a quiz, but we look at other forms of news, like we looked at social media and how do we tell if news is real? It's like when we're studying any degree, how do we know if this source is reliable, this interpretation is accurate? The news is the same. Social media, how can they tell? We're guiding them towards thinking that. And then with the nice sort of focus at the end of like how can they use that in the community? How can they then grow up to be very active citizens who are getting involved in community-based projects and questioning society? We don't want them to be like following orders and just autonomous people. We want them to question society, and by showing them how to question the news as something so basic of, you see an article, you see anything a politician says, question it, ask questions, challenge it. That then will sort of help them go into the community as young people, young adults, who will be, again, making the difference. What can that sort of empower them to do? The last sort of thing I just want to summarise the main point of really how I've engaged children in human rights in the classroom, and not necessarily just in my lessons, but in a school-based environment, and then through the work as a Holocaust educational ambassador. Human voice I found is the most powerful aspect, showing them an individual, giving them a life to follow. Even if for example, I'm doing World War I medicine, you wouldn't think you can use individuals. Having a story of this person started in this battle, they went to this hospital, and giving that as a connection, something to follow through with, they follow through with lives on social media, they're following all famous people. Giving that in the past is a way of doing that. Using different events to connect with others and similarities and drawing those comparisons, not in a way of trying to downplay one event compared to another, but opening up those questions of have human rights violations ended? Are they still going on? Why do they take place in this area, not this area? Looking at that and opening up those pathways for educators, and then giving them that sense of it's okay to feel frustrated at the past or at current events, channeling that into the right way and looking at where they can use the news, how they can question it. I found as really effective methods. We can talk about the situation with Russia and Ukraine and connect that to the past, but give them that chance of how can you help, even if it's something so small, how can you help to empower the young people into thinking, I want to do something.